visible. Great.
So thank you for sharing that valuable framework. In the past 2 days, we have witnessed a host of intriguing conversations on how Indian psychology can contribute to the emerging global scholarship. And one of the themes which has come out, very well is that Western psychology still focuses a lot on states, emotions, attitudes, and things which are, bound by temporal limitations. Whereas Indian psychology, the key strength is that it focuses on the ekam sat, the unchangeable, the intransient. And perhaps its biggest contribution to the world in the form of yoga is giving us a practice of realizing that ekam sat, that intransient nature of human being. Today, to share more on the impact of yoga on our business, on our society, on our institutions, we have Professor E.S. Srinivas and Professor Rajen Gupta. Welcome, sir. Before that, I'll just give a short formal introduction of our speakers. Professor Rajen Gupta did his engineering from IIT Kanpur and PhD from IIM Ahmedabad. He has over 30 years of experience both in academia and industry. He has taught at various institutions like MDI Gurgaon, IIM Lucknow, Erasmus University, the Netherlands. He has served on international editorial boards of various journals such as the International Journal of Cross-Cultural Management and Journal of Research Practice. And most interestingly, he is a founder of the National HRD Network, as well as iSoul Foundation, which is a non-profit working on research on leadership and how Indian knowledge traditions contribute to leadership. Professor E.S. Srinivas is currently professor at IIM Bangalore in the OB and HRM area. He has taught at various eminent institutions such as XLRI Jamshedpur and Indian School of Business, Hyderabad. He's a member of the Aon Hewitt think tank on HR and leadership since 2012. His research has been published in astounding journals such as Mindfulness, Journal of Applied Psychology. Professor Srinivas has been very, very instrumental in the Bharatiya management movement, which aims to introduce classical Indian management wisdom as a course in B schools across India. So once again, I welcome you, sir, and thank you for sparing your time for the YOGASTHA conference. With this, I hand over the session to you.
Professor Rajen Gupta, you need to unmute yourself.
Done it. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, great.
Okay, just the initial remarks, and I'll request Professor Rajen Gupta to. Initially, I was very happy when Professor Pandey invited me to join this conference. I was happy that this is a topic of my interest, and I have an area of interest for a long time. But one of the mistakes he has committed is that area of interest, he has taken it as area of expertise. So, and also initially I was happy, but I think I'm now suspicious of Dr. Pandey's intentions, because on the panel you have Rajen Gupta, and he's his teacher, and he would love to kind of highlight him. To highlight Rajen Gupta, he needs a contrast.
Come on.
He needs a contrast. So Rajen Gupta do not need a contrast to shine. So I just, because I met Rajen Gupta as a doctoral student to seek ideas and suggestions on my proposal as a PhD student. Okay, these it's amazing conference. Yesterday I attended few sessions in part, and then just make some comments and request Rajen to start the conversation. One of the points in the email of Dr. Pandey was, let this be a conversational style. So I didn't make huge PPTs, but I have one slide to clarify one point. Maybe I'll show that if required. Do we have the facility to upload a slide here? I can do that, I suppose.
Yes, you can share, sir.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about yoga, the title for the session is Yoga and Psychology. And so I'll make few remarks and then my kind of concerns, then Rajen would is Rajan, is that way? He said conversational style, but we can make our initial remarks and then start a conversation. Is that okay?
Oh, yes,
Yes,
perfectly
sir.
fine.
Yeah. So one of the, when we see the word yoga, when we want to do research in that, so my kind of coming from an organizational behavior background and coming primarily from a management school, B school point of view, I have two concerns. One is research and second is executive education. This conference is on research, but I also kind of want to address the research. If you want to do a little more applied, you need to, how do you bring this to a kind of format and so on. So one of the things I have kind of struggled is to, these concepts are very, one hand they are rich, but I think yesterday, Dr. Mahadevan, what is his name?
Jayaraman.
Jayaraman, Dr. Mahadevan Jayaraman Mahadevan talked about how commentaries, for a single word, it can have different meanings and so on and so forth. So I was actually reading some books on yoga, and one of the scholars whom yesterday was cited said only in Hindu yoga, you ignore the Buddhist, Jainism, and various other kind of sources. Only in Hindu yoga, he has identified about 40 yogas. And so the yoga is not a one term which has same meaning across scriptures, across different kinds of things. So whenever we do research or whenever we reflect on these things, not only we learn in behavioral science research that you should be context specific. In addition to that, in this Indian kind, we should be text specific also. So text specific means what is yoga according to Patanjali is probably not exactly same, though they are related, is to Sankhya yoga, or when you talk about different kinds of yoga in Bhagavad Gita, or whatever, Jnana yoga, Bhakti yoga, these are maybe at the essential ultimate point it is same, but in terms of how they are, even the words that are used, whether it is chitta or whether it is any of these terms, how it is used in Sankhya, how it is used in Patanjali, there are variations, and sometimes these subtle variations can have significant implications in theory building and theory testing. So when we say something, let's not use this as one term, try to integrate, review, and get an operational definition. That's the kind of way we do research. And I will give my definition kind of thing. I don't know that approach helps us in researching yoga and trying to draw implications for that. So we should treat each one of them as theoretical frameworks. So within, just like leadership has some 40 odd theories, and in each, LMX leadership is different, transformation leadership it is different, in adaptive leadership it is very different, though, and fundamentally it is an influencing process, but there are huge differences in terms of the way it is operationalized and issues that are addressed in leadership, based on level of analysis, based on kind of where it is coming from. So we need to retain that contextual sensitivity and textual specificity. That's first my learning from some of reading from some of these things. The second interesting thing is about yoga. If there is no better psychology book than yoga, in according to personal kind of observation, which may be sounding biased, but the more I read about Patanjali, the more I read about yoga, I realized all the research I've been doing on emotional intelligence, on various other kinds of things, the essential, fundamental human existence related issues have been addressed, clarified to such great depth and such great elaboration that I feel that maybe I'm realizing when I'm already kind of old. So everybody wants to be younger, but now I want to be younger with a different reason. Want to restart my research journey differently. I really appreciate and also envy Dr. Pandey that he's in such a great journey facilitating this kind of thing. So one is the concepts are rich, very meaning, and which requires, and some of the yesterday's speaker have talked about how you need some Sanskrit and understanding of commentaries. So first basic question I have, whether Rajan or somebody else would address, is without knowing Sanskrit, without reading the basic texts, and understanding theoretical perspective from the proposer's point of view, can we do research or draw implications, which may be helpful, but will it be kind of valid or will it be useful is one issue that bothered me. So second point, which is when I do kind of teaching, I have when I teach change, personal change or organizational change, I've always used concepts from yoga, but because it has a less acceptance in the past, but more openness and acceptance now, both in academic and practitioner circles compared to 2 decades ago when I started my journey. So this is now I can probably make it more those ideas explicit, but earlier I used to use the existing OB concepts, which are semantically somewhat similar, but not richer enough to capture the essence of this yoga ideas. But at the same time use them. Maybe I can give an example as we converse further. So there seems to be a useful parallels where they're not parallels, but they can be kind of taken as indicative. So when I talk about resistance, when I talk about change, when I talk about cognitive restructuring, all of them, when I read Yoga Patanjali and other things, there are much richer and concepts which are representing them in much more greater detail. So maybe I would give some examples and elaborations as we progress. These are my first comments is, these are concepts which are text specific. That's first thing. So you should not like have defining yoga as something of my own definition. Aurobindo's yoga, maybe Patanjali's yoga, maybe Sankhya yoga, and Bhagavad Gita, different kinds of yoga. And these are like defined so very differently. So there is definitional variety for different frameworks or different purposes. So how do you retain this diversity and richness at the same time as a typical academic kind of thing you want to integrate and arrive at an operational definition to do research and so on. So these are my initial comments. Rajan, I think would respond, or you can make your comments and then we'll have a conversation later.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Srinivas. Wonderful thoughts you have shared. When Professor Pandey asked me to be a part of this session, I went through a bit of a confusion whether the session was on yoga and Indian psychology or yoga and psychology. And when I started thinking, I felt that I would like to talk about yoga and psychology, and whereby I mean that yoga is an Indian knowledge system and psychology is a Western knowledge system. So I'm taking it from their origins. And why I am doing so is that when I thought I'll start by taking a personal perspective, just like Professor Srinivas took on some aspects. I must share that, I share the same handicap. I think that's what Professor Srinivas meant. I do not know Sanskrit. So that has been a handicap, and but I worked around it for my purpose, and I'll come to that. Secondly, I think when I started thinking about myself, I couldn't help but going back to more than 50 years, because I have the advantage of age. Because just to tell briefly a story, and why I'm doing so is that as Professor Pandey mentioned, and I'm glad he emphasized it, that sadhana is important for doing research on yoga. I also have, through my career, also felt this kind of a sadhana is equally important even if you want to do Western psychology. So there has to be a sadhana in that tradition. And so I think that the overall framework of listening, reflecting, and then nididhyasan, which has been proposed by Indian thought, as a way of learning is applicable even concepts outside India, and that feels good to think. So let me come back, because Indian philosophy and Western psychology have remained in my life. They have been active in my life for almost 53 years. Because when I was a IIT Kanpur student, I had a first course in Western psychology. Next year, I took an elective in Indian philosophy. And to add to that, when I was doing the course on Indian philosophy, I also had a course on modern quantum physics. And that is when I first started seeing some resonances between Advaita Vedanta and quantum mechanics. But then, of course, and that was also the time when my interest shifted from science and technology to human aspects, what was generally called social science. So that's how, as my friends know, I never worked as an engineer, and I started doing my own reading, sort of a self-study. And that to me, about 48 years ago, I almost read 2 books, at the same time. And I wish to mention it. One was Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, and the other was The Life Divine by Sri Aurobindo. And that set a trend in my life. For many, many years, I would spend morning hours every day doing some preliminary yoga, reading Indian philosophy, and I would spend evenings reading Western psychology. And as I was reflecting last couple of days on these aspects of my life, I began to feel very clear that I have personally benefited from both. So that to me is an important point, a bit of a perhaps a kind of a discordant note for this conference. But I think I personally think that my tradition does allow me to pick up ideas from wherever they come. So I have no issues with that. And then, now, next year, I also learned, I'm talking of 1973, I learned a technique called transcendental meditation, which was kind of designed based on the ancient texts by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And I learned it in 1973. Initially, I practiced it off and on, but for the last couple of decades, I've been practicing it every day. Now, so this is the little practice I do on the yogic side. A little bit of asanas, a little bit of pranayam, a little bit of transcendental meditation, and a little bit of reading. On the Western psychology side, of course, I initially, as I said, I got interested in Sigmund Freud. I did not seem to get attracted to the mainstream positivist psychology, because when I joined a program on applied psychology in IIT Kharagpur, I found it so boring that I wanted to leave it, and I was lucky to get a job in State Bank of India, which helped me leave that program. But that also took me to another kind of a applied Western psychology, which I don't know how many members of this conference would have heard about, but I'm sure Professor Srinivas knows it and Professor Pandey knows it. This is called sensitivity training. So sensitivity training is a method of helping people understand themselves and others through an application of social psychology and certain learning theories. And I found it to be so exciting. And I must mention here that I still think that sensitivity training is one of the best educational methods available to help people understand human beings. Whole library of psychology perhaps will not help you understand yourself or understand others. And that's why, in a lighter vein, very often people comment about psychology professors that how can he be so insensitive? Doesn't he know how to behave? Why does he behave like this? Because theoretical psychology, just like theoretical yoga, may not take you far. So I have been lucky because my professors were kind of founders of Indian Society for Applied Behavioral Science in India. They encouraged me to go through that, and I became a professional member, and I have my certified facilitator of sensitivity training. So I have been exposed to that kind of application of Western psychology. Simultaneously, because I was experiencing some personal anxieties, and I had great difficulty in writing my PhD dissertation, I took the help of psychotherapy, which was based on Western psychology. Initially, my psychotherapist was an ego therapist of Hartman School, and later on, I found a very wonderful psychoanalyst who has really helped me understand myself more and more and more to the point, just to give an indicator that through this process, I could go back, I have been able to go back to a certain event in my life when I was 6 months old, at a pre-verbal stage. And that has, in my exploration, I have found to be one of the crucial things in the way I began to experience a certain kind of depression and anxiety. On the other hand, let me quickly shift gears. Doing transcendental meditation every day is extremely useful for my daily life. It is a very elementary meditation technique. I have not learned the advanced meditation technique which Maharishi Mahesh Yogi had developed. But I have found this transcendental meditation so helpful every day, doing it every day morning. Not only does it help me contain my anxiety, but it also helps me become more creative. It also helps me relate to people in a more calm fashion. So, just to give you these glimpses that I have experienced sensitivity training, psychoanalysis as an application of Western psychology. I have gone through transcendental meditation. I practice it. I do certain pranayams. I do certain simple yogas, which were taught to me by a wonderful teacher, and which I find extremely useful. I miss it. If I don't do it one day, I miss it next day, and I want to do it as soon as possible. So I wish to propose to this conference that when we're talking about yoga and psychology, yoga as an Indian thought and psychology as a Western thought system, I think both have value. Now, I think Professor Srinivas made some comment, and I'm delighted to hear this, that what he's discovering now, that Indian concepts are richer than the Western concepts which he felt compelled to use in his research. I have struggled with, so far as whole Vedic, I mean, I'm not a specialist in yoga, And I must mention, as I mentioned to you a little while ago, that my source was initially from Sri Aurobindo, and as I mentioned, because Sri Aurobindo wrote his original works in English, so I have read Sri Aurobindo as if I was reading Sanskrit, because he is considered to be an extremely good writer in English language. His poem Savitri is considered to be, a world-class poetry in English language. And if someone can write poetry in any language, he or she is generally supposed to be very adept at that language. And of course, Sri Aurobindo's English is not easy to understand. I still struggle. But overall, I will make a kind of my critical assessment of Vedic body of knowledge and the Western psychology. I mean, it is very clear that the Indian Vedic body of knowledge, especially the yogic tradition, is extremely, its main interest is in, human consciousness, actually consciousness at large, but more specifically human consciousness.
You unmute yourself, Rajan. Professor Rajan Gupta. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay. So there's no doubt that yogic literature, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, I have given a good quick reading to it, and a friend of mine is doing some very deep work on it. So I read some of his documents, which tell me that Yoga Sutras are a tremendously rich source of insights into our inner life. And I'm not using the word psyche right now because this is a Western word. Of course, Sri Aurobindo uses it quite freely, but I'm trying to stick to the Adhyatmic tradition. So a closer word is self. And the small self with small s and self with capital S sometimes is helpful, but in speaking it doesn't come through that clearly. So I'm convinced that, let me put it differently. When you put these, the Western psychology and Vedic tradition of study of self, what strikes me as an important thing observation to make is that, and this was made by, Carl Jung also in Western tradition, that most of the Western psychology is either looking at the normal state of affairs, average human being, and starting with Sigmund Freud, some of the lower levels of consciousness, which he called unconscious. I'm using the word lower. It is not Sigmund Freud's word. It's my word because I am going to contrast it with the higher levels of consciousness. So Carl Jung, who was exposed to Indian philosophy and Indian yogic knowledge, he himself recognized this lacuna of psychoanalytic thinking, and he tried to make up for it. But most of the Western psychology is trying to deal with common average human being. And it's very convenient because they're always looking for generalizations about human behavior. If you are looking for exceptions, then you are not going to find generalization. On the other hand, the Vedic tradition, the yogic tradition, or Sri Aurobindo's tradition considers this our normal existence as avidya. So in that tradition, naturally, our normal average existence becomes in some sense very unimportant. And this is my reading, I could be wrong, that the most of the yogic Vedic psychology, if I may use the word now, is really saying that is all right, but let's think of better things. Let us think of higher things, and let us worry about higher levels of where can we be, the human potential in that sense, rather than getting stuck with the normal ignorance. So, in my view, Western psychology has focused on the average and the what they call abnormal, normal and abnormal, and the East Indian Vedic psychologies, if I may now loosely use this word, has focused on higher possibilities of ourselves. So this is one important thing I wish to put on the plate. I don't know whether Professor Srinivas would agree with me or not, and I would like to hear his comments. I think I have spoken enough in terms of just putting this to yoga as a knowledge of self. And I may just mention one more thing and come back, hand it over to Professor Srinivas. That I can come back to it later. That one reason why I like Professor Sri Aurobindo is that Sri Aurobindo, because he is a product, as perhaps you would know, many of you would know, all his education happened in England in the top level institutions, and so he was very familiar with the latest developments in Western thought, including the theory of evolution, because Charles Darwin's theory had already come in and psychoanalysis had come in. So he was thoroughly aware of the Western thought. So one of the beauties of Sri Aurobindo's thought is that he has made a wonderful attempt to bring together our knowledge about self of the psyche from the Western point of view and our knowledge of the self from the Vedic point of view. And he has tried to build an integrated framework, which I will propose in the later, maybe I'll propose it to the scholars to look at as a possible framework for doing research. But anyway, I'll stop there. Professor Srinivas.
Yes, Professor Rajen Gupta. I think, as I already mentioned, I met Professor Rajen Gupta as a PhD student. So I treat him as my mentor academically. So I keep going back to him for ideas. But what I like about people like Professor Rajen Gupta and even earlier Professor Uday Parikh, his teacher, was they gave the freedom to us, all students, to differ with them. And they not only give freedom, they respected that kind of different point of view. So hence I kind of venture to disagree with Professor Rajen Gupta.
Great. So
one thing is, maybe I'll make my comments. I'm with the big rider that I'm neither a full expert on Western psychology nor Indian psychology, but I've been a student trying to learn a little bit from both of them. So first is, even the positive psychology has accused the traditional Western psychology as psychology that has developed primarily by studying people who are abnormal. It's not a study of normal people first. Because the basic psychology of barring William James and initial psychologists who before the experimental research came in, they were like more aligned or kind of grounded in philosophy. When they branched out of philosophy, in a way it gave a very independent and so-called scientific kind of thing, but at the same time it gave a very different perspective, because the initial funding, initial studies, initial need for psychology came out of post-Second World War. People were disturbed, people were kind of things. So primarily studying patients, clients who were not normal. So this is not a normal psychology. I would say predominantly abnormal psychology. So it came from two streams. Primarily the theoretical framework, Freud and others, everybody studied patients. They have not studied healthy, functioning, normal individuals. They studied people who are having adjustment problems. They're having issues with the kind of normal functioning. So it's not a normal psychology to begin with. That is being increasingly acknowledged in psychology, and more so with positive psychology and humanistic psychology. So that's the first one. The primary input came from people who are suffering from whatever psychosis, neurosis, or adjustment problems, or whatever, anxiety, depression. So the number of studies that were done on anxiety, depression, well, those, the positive psychologists call it as negative experiences, is like 98% of the studies in the first several decades. Nobody studied love. Nobody studied happiness directly. Nobody studied growth in that sense, except maybe Maslow and few other humanistic psychologists. So growth is viewed as recovering from ill health. So, and when health is also being defined by WHO and various other international bodies, is not absence of disease, but presence of some positive aspects, which is vitality, which is immunity, which is kind of various other kinds of presence of some positive life forces, rather than absence of negative or adjustment problems. When you define health as that way, when you're trying to use psychology for well-being and mental health, yeah, we are using a disease model for a developmental objective. So that's my first concern, which is also kind of shared by the humanistic and psychologists and positive psychologists. That's the first kind of thing. Second, I'm not discounting or taking away the credit and contributions of Western psychology. Whenever I read any psychologist original book, I almost see them as rishis, some of the original people, but the kind of insights they have seen and the deep introspection they have done in trying to understand human psyche, I'm not discounting their contribution or intellect or analysis. But I think the first two kind of point is, so second is the Indian psychology is not abnormal. Maybe we can say, if normality is statistically defined, it is abnormal. But normality, you can say above normal or same. It is more evolutionarily defined or not democratically defined. It's not that more people are there, but more people are longing to, more people are striving to, more people have the potential to aspire to. In that sense, it is common, but it's a common kind of urge or inclination or a tendency to grow, realize, know oneself, and so on and so forth. So two aspects of that is focused on Indian psychology. Just to give an example, and it's not philosophical. This is also, I had this opinion that is very, very philosophical and not practical, but I realized the amount of practice that underlie the Indian psychology is not studying 100 other fellows and coming to a conclusion. It is experimenting on self, dedicated life, doing it on one's own self, and reporting results is what, like, deep contemplation and practice. Many of these rishis have written. So it is like practice. If you see Patanjali Yoga Sutras, for example, from a one angle, it looks like some parts of it is like yoga books and or athletes manuals. They are not philosophical kind of thing. Do this way, do this is one kind of pranayama, this is the asana, the do's and don'ts. It's like almost like a manual, engineering manual. But at the same time, it is so profound in defining the states which you are trying to experience through these activities. I'll just make an example of second chapter of Patanjali Yoga Sutras, which talks about Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga is the word itself, I find it very kind of interesting. Kriya means action or activities, whereas yoga, there are many meanings: balance, oneness, and stillness. So how do we move from action to stillness seems to be the goal of that second chapter. And not from action to stillness, through actions. you do certain actions in a particular way, kind of experimented and kind of suggested ways of doing this. And these actions are not behavioral, but not just only physical, but they're also mental and emotional aspects of it. So when you practice these actions over a consistent period of time in a particular guided fashion, then you, through action, you get into stillness, which is a higher and different form of stillness rather than absence of action. Absence of action is a very tamasic or a lethargic or the difference between a sleeping buffalo and a meditating saint. And sleeping buffalo is in action, meditating saint is also still. But these two stillness are very, very different in terms of their state of existence and also the process through which they arrive at this stillness. So the way the action and states stillness were integrated in Indian psychology is at once it is practical and philosophical. So what impressed me as I read more, though I am not an expert, is the profundity of what a great philosophy can have, at the same time exactitude or specificity of an athlete's manual. So I'm just talking about only Patanjali Yoga Sutras kind of thing. Yes, we are all challenged in terms of, once we don't know Sanskrit, and second, yesterday the person mentioned there are without commentaries, there are no and forth. So when I was actually reading some of them, I was struck by three concepts. How do you, for example, personal change? When you try to do personal change in psychology, whether you take well-being or personal transformation or anything you try to address through psychology, there are 2 or 3 steps basically we do. The first one is, when you are trying to change, whenever you are trying to transform or change, any positive change will have resistance. And how do you manage or overcome resistance seems to be the first step or first concern. Whenever you're trying to change from the status quo, there will be resistance. We call it unfreezing or resistance or whatever you want to call it as. That is the first thing in individual behavioral change or even organizational change. Handling first is, how do you manage, overcome the resistance to positive change, which required some your dedication to the goal, your commitment to the actions and various other kinds of change in behavior requires a lot of handling resistance. The second one seems to be, it's not just action, you need to reflect on these actions. And when, for example, in organizational behavior literature, we talk about cognitive restructuring, or even Levin's David Kolb's theory of concrete experience followed by reflective observation. So action, reflection, and for example, if you take the Kolb's theory in psychology, which I find very, very fascinating, and I use it on and off in my classes, it talks about 2 different axes. One is concrete and second is abstract. And one is action and second is reflection. So how shuttling between 2 extremes in a sequential and iterative manner, you facilitate learning. So, and if you apply this to kind of Indian thought, there are clear-cut experiences, concrete actions to be taken, followed by reflection and study. I really liked yesterday's presentation who talked about Swadhyaya. Like, Swadhyaya is reflection. Swadhyaya is not guided reflection and wise reflection, and it's not anxious reflection. So it's not brooding or worrying, but it's about really questions about, and the third one is, first is the resistance, second is the Swadhyaya, reflection or reading about it and observation of that. And the third one is, how do you, even after all the effort, sometimes you go thus far and not further. You are not yet ready. When you are not yet ready, you should have the grace and calmness to accept things. So, acceptance, for example, in counseling, acceptance and positive regard is such a fundamental thing. And even in mindfulness foundational attitude, Kabat-Zinn talks about acceptance, curiosity, and non-evaluation as the fundamental requirements for behavioral change. And in this third one, if you take the three concepts of Kriya Yoga from Patanjali, the first one is tapas, handling resistance. How do you do sadhana? And not by forced one. Tapas is voluntarily discomfort you are undertaking for your goal, which you have higher requirements. So tapas is never comfortable, but unless you have ruchi or rasa in tapas, you can't sustain and continue to. How do you create? So doing tapas is something you voluntarily taking discomfort and voluntarily accepting kind of not so easy, comfortable thing is the first step for change, which I think, and that too not forced, but you have the ruchi or you have the rasa of the goal or the intention. And second one is the swadhyaya, which is study, reflection, guided guru or whatever it is. And the third one is, so there are different meanings of it, but I like that concept of Ishvara Pranidhana, that acceptance and faith that you, and also one of the fun repeated concepts that comes in Indian psychology is to, one of my spiritual mentors used to quote, say this, do your best and leave the rest. So do your best, you should have full focus and absorption in whatever you do. To leave the rest, you should have the let go and not willing kind of getting upset with the results. So both need to be done and both are not easy. So just somebody has already pointed to me, we have only 5 minutes to comment. For example, final point, when I say I use this emotional intelligence framework for leadership development, they talk about self-awareness as the first thing to get, then do self-regulation, do understand social kind of understanding of social perception or social awareness and relationship management. When I was reading Patanjali, I got an interesting insight. It is not that self-awareness leading to self-regulation. It is actually starting with self-regulation so that your higher aspects of self, you become aware. So the causal arrow or starting point in Indian psychology is to start with self-regulation, which is tapas, and realization is awareness of your different aspects is self-awareness. It's not cognitive understanding, you are having an informed action. Your knowledge is developed out of effort. That is a very practical approach to building knowledge rather than just a theoretical way of building knowledge. Yeah, these are my quick comments. Somebody said we should have questions.
Yeah, I think let's go for questions.
Thank you so much, sir,
Yeah.
for sharing your views on what is the relevance of yoga for us personally as well as the society in large. I have a few questions for you. First is, how can we analyze the impact of yoga or Indian psychology on business? For example, if we consider the case of diversity, there is a lot of studies and literature which say that you will have certain financial, technological, and other benefits if you have diversity. How can we come up with some tangible metrics to show that following these practices would actually lead to certain business outcomes? My question comes from the perspective that why should businesses get interested in this?
You want to respond, Rajan? Professor Rajan Gupta?
My response is very simple, so you can take over from there. I think some of these obsession with wanting to correlate, one action to something which is where the outcome is has 101 factors attributing to it. I don't think we have methodologies to assess these kinds of relationships. People make some kind of predictive analytics that is good for itself, but it will never tell us about how this one yoga leads to bigger business results. That is not, in my view, that's an impossible proposition.
Yeah, in my kind of just quick response is this concern seems to be more with academicians rather than for the organizations. First, because companies like Google, Monsanto, and various other organizations are actually using techniques which are based on neuroscience and psychology and mindfulness-based things. Like Search Inside Yourself is like a big leadership development program which is developed at Google, now being offered to different organizations, which exactly uses from neuroscience, but the essential aspects are from mindfulness, or you can call it as Buddhist or Indian ideas about how your ability to focus. Attentional regulation is fundamental for excellence, creativity, is a kind of your personal experience and organizationally. There are medical research papers. In fact, the person who championed this mindfulness is a doctor. So he's a medical doctor, he's an MD. So, and how they have medical journals, scores of studies showing that which most organizations are trying to manage, whether it is stress or emotional regulation or emotional intelligence, various things which you come under your leadership development, which are related to their effectiveness as leaders, all of them were significantly predicted, right from physical health to mental health parameters. There is overwhelming evidence to say that these have implications which are significantly valued by organizations. That is one. Second, the studies on these things from organizations in itself is very low. So before to study, we need an open-mindedness rather than doubt. We need to, if these have kind of helped so much in medicine, why not in the organizational context? So when we advertise with the hope that it will result in sales, though it's not necessarily the case in most cases, but how are you willing to experiment and improve things? That openness and willingness to experiment incrementally to improve that is what is required. And personally, when I offer these programs, a lot of organizations of late have approached me to do programs on leading mindfully. And another company recently have already done some 6 or 7 programs on happiness. And part of the program, it's a 3-day workshop on happiness, business asking for program on happiness. Only research scholars have concern why happiness is relevant in the organizational context.
Okay, sir. So another question. So you use the term mindfulness, and probably Karl Zen was instrumental in introducing the concept to mainstream. But over the last few years, we have seen that although it began as a Buddhist practice, right now the references to Buddhism are reducing, and it has been repackaged into MBTI and all those sort of corporatized packages. So how do we prevent, when it comes to even Indian concepts, how do we prevent this cultural appropriation of Indian concepts and repackaging it and being forwarded by Western scholars as their own?
Professor Rajen, Gupta.
No, go ahead. Srinivas.
No, this Indians only say, "Tum phal khao na, ped ka kyun poste ho?" So on the one hand, you say you want results, not kind of giving credit to anything else. Your obsessive instrumental orientation will make it commoditization and commercialization. That's first orientation in itself. Second, this is being appropriated because there seem to be huge excess baggage that comes from the word Hindu or Buddhist. Okay, for example, Buddhism as philosophy was developed by a kind of initially developed by Buddha to teach his followers who have given up kind of their marriage and regular life, and the followers of him, that was given to him. So typically for a monkhood, those books or trainings are given, and it is not given for a regular householder, which is slightly different, fortunately, for Indian psychology, where it was given to a king who is fighting, who wants to fight better. He don't want to give it up. So Bhagavad Gita was given to a person who is a king, and you find renunciation as only one of the stages of life, not at the kind of as a way of life right from the beginning, though detachment is a mindset, but regular act. So there is a greater integration. So whenever you use Hindu or Buddhist thing, there seems to be a lot of this concern for religion, secularity, or baggage of things. Like when you bring this, are you bringing God with it? Are you bringing a kind of religious God? So when you can promote Indian psychology or Indian thought, free of religious thing, more with the scientific evidence, more with scientific kind, that I'm just looking for research scholars who are willing to work on Hindu view of mindfulness, because there are so many papers on Buddhist foundations of mindfulness, but Buddha and Buddhism was significantly influenced by. So, but at the same time, I am not getting here to crave for the credit, but if there is no better nuanced understanding or enrichment of our understanding by going to other scriptures, hence we should go for it. In fact, many of these rishis, when even Patanjali too is not being credited as the author of sutras, he's only summarizing the previous wisdom. Vyasa has not been authorized as author of Vedas. He's only organized and classified stuff. Most of Upanishads, many times we don't know who is author. So appropriation and commercialization is a modern day kind of a thing, which is not, I'm saying we should use it, but it's which comes through willingness to write, read, and do scientific research rather than championing or canvassing without a kind of a very scientific relooking at of these things. So what we need, I think I always like Professor Rajen Gupta's idea, we need not just believers or kind of disbelievers, we need to move from advocacy to inquiry. So are you willing to inquire with an open mind and a critical mind, and then say that this finding is much better than what is already existing? Then we'll be able to add value and get the credit. Yeah, as an Indian, I always feel Indian thought has not been given as much credit as it ought to be. For most of the I do research and mindfulness and I do training, but I'm always concerned about it.
Okay. So on a related note, one last question from one of the audience members, that whenever the person writes to, a scholar tries to write a paper, there is a demand for recent references and citations. And quoting the recent references becomes a problem when you want to forward the original text. So is there a possible way to resolve this?
If you see some of the top journals in AMJ or various other journals, the fundamental idea that is tested is not the recent one, many times. Okay, on which some work has been done, you are not missing if there is a recent one. So recency as a primary, as a premium, is only when you are missing some of the recent studies. If there are no recent studies, for example, some of the papers published, if you're talking about exchange theory, you're talking about the old theory. And if you're talking about bystander effect, it is an old kind of existed social psychology long ago. If there are some recent relevant references, you need to cite. In fact, I had a conversation with Professor J.B. Sinha long back, which I kind of talked to him saying that he's the only one of the few Indians who are being cited outside India. And he's not writing about Indian thought or positive aspects of Indian contribution. So as a reaction to my comment repeatedly to him, he wrote one paper for Banasri Vidyapith and sent that to me saying that you can cite this in your paper. So interestingly now, there are enough papers. There is a medical science research on neuroscience basis for some of the yoga and mudras and kinds of things. So there is a very lot of openness in basic sciences, and there also, when I say applied sciences, whether it is counseling, whether it is medicine, where they have to get results, they are more open for different possibilities. Wherever there are not intervening with the reality, like experimental social psychologists, and those are very closed for any of these new ideas because they are not affecting reality, they are only studying and building theories. So in that sense, even if it's an old idea, if there is somewhat equivalent to some recent kind of thing is there, how it is adding value beyond that, you should have a recent reference. Rather than just giving recent reference is not a premium. Professor Rajen Gupta.
Okay, I think we don't have much time. Coming to the whole idea of appropriation, I think Professor Srinivas has made a very valid point that how we don't know the origins. And actually, to me, it is a very natural process when somebody is adopting an idea. The original, I often say in a lighter vein, in social science, actually there is never a new idea. If you search enough, you can always go back to Aristotle, Plato in the Western world, and you can go back to Vedas in the Indian world. So, because human beings have not changed in last 10,000 years, human beings have largely remained the same. There has been no major change in the brain. There has been no major change in any aspect. So this appropriation is a natural human process we do it ourselves. We forget what our grandfather taught us, and we start thinking that it is our idea. That is one aspect to it. The other aspect, which we must take cognizance of it, but rather than cribbing about it, that even the world of knowledge, there is a play of power in it. And actually this French postmodern philosopher Michel Foucault reversed the equation between power and truth. We often say that truth is power, knowledge is power. He shows through detailed studies, historical studies, that what is considered knowledge at a particular point in time is very largely determined by who is in power. So there is a power politics even in the field of knowledge, though I must also say that perhaps it is the least in the field of knowledge. It's much more in the other fields of human affairs, but it is still there in the field of knowledge. And there are gatekeepers, journal editors, reviewers, etc. And they, for good reason, the Sanskrit terms don't make sense to them. They don't know the citations that you are making. So if you want to publish in AMR, AMJ, then what they can understand, only that they will accept. So it is also a bigger issue. I have often talked about it through Dr. Pandey. It requires that we develop a very strong scholarly community in India. We develop our own journals, give respect to those journals. We publish our best work in those journals. We defy the current norms. Only then we will develop. That's how new disciplines develop even in the West. So we have to brace ourselves for this very demanding struggle if we want our ideas. But I can only tell you historically that in last 30 years, things have improved a great deal. Partly because of the economic reasons, Indian economy is doing better. Partly because the Western knowledge stock is beginning to show its warts, its weaknesses. People are reaching the thresholds of ignorance, and they are looking for new ideas. So we need to do much more than what we are doing so far. As Professor Pandey said in the beginning, and Professor Srinivas mentioned about me, just being evangelists about our ideas is not going to take us forward. I was glad to hear Dr. Pandey mentioning that a lot of the attendees in this conference are not only theoretical readers of Vedic literature, but also sadhakas. Because to me, the whole yogic knowledge, Vedantic knowledge, what William James called radical empiricism, it's not, of course we can do some experimental studies to show certain correlations between certain independent and dependent variables. But the true thing happens inside the human being. And that I don't know when neuroscience will be able to fully track it. And if brain and mind are not the same thing, there's a big debate about it. Neuroscience can tap into brain. We don't yet have any methodology to tap into the mind if it is separate from brain. So we need whole lot of first person research. We need whole lot of subjective research, truly subjective research. And just my last comment as a pointer, I'm absolutely fascinated by one thing which Sri Aurobindo has mentioned in his book Human Cycle, because he accepted the idea of evolution. He says world is going through the age of reason. In the age of reason, rationality, cause-effect relationships, external objective validation, etc. are important. But very, very interestingly, Sri Aurobindo has prophesied that after the age of reason will come the age of subjectivity. And only after age of subjectivity will come age of spirituality. So to me, if I take a hint from there, we need to develop a new paradigm of research. We need to get good at it. We need to argue for it. We need to develop journals to publish in that paradigm. And we need to challenge. We need to do comparative studies of Western paradigms and Indian paradigms. Not only by working on we are a global world. We have to show that how Indian concepts are richer than the Western concepts, as Professor Srinivas has mentioned. I think it needs very thorough comparative research, very deep first-person subjective research. So there's a whole research agenda which we need to develop. I've been talking to Dr. Pandey on this issue for a number of years, and I think he's the leader in the field now. So I'm hoping that he will take the next steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your valuable insights. I apologize to the audience. We cannot take all the questions as we are bereft of time. Once again, thank you for sparing the time and addressing us. Over to you, Professor Ashish Pandey.